great to be back. Thank you very, very much for inviting me again, Heather. I was here a short time ago, and it's an enormous honour to participate in this event. And is that better? Great. And particularly an honour for me because it is dedicated to the work of Melanie Phillips. What struck me when I was last here is that you all seem to have a very good idea about the situation in Britain and about the sort of arguments and debates and the state of play and the various participants in England when it comes to the problem of radical Islam. So I think that you all pretty much know about Melanie Phillips. But I did want to add my 2 pence worth. I think it's fair to say that she is a singular and particularly courageous voice in Britain. She's perhaps, I think she is probably the best known journalist to, if you like, the majority of people. Through her columns in the Daily Mail, from her basically appearances on such programs as Question Time, which is a political program that the BBC does, and from a long-running radio show called The Moral Maze. Her voice is very, very singular, and her courage in saying what she says, I think, is pretty unique. I might appear sometimes to Melanie as though I'm a stalker of some kind. We have something called stalkers in England. I should explain. I first saw her actually speaking at a meeting of a think tank called Policy Exchange in Britain. It was about 4 years ago. The whole room was pretty much against her. I can't quite remember the topic.
I can.
Right. But she was remarkable and extremely impressive. And then, again, I happened to be on a show called The Moral Maze, which she was on. And then she came to the very first meeting of the New Culture Forum to talk about her new book, Londonistan, which is what we're celebrating today. And, well, here I am again today, Melanie, so I think I'm sort of following you around. But I think you're probably used to that by now. Her voice is particular in that, although we are concerned particularly with Londonistan and with radical Islam and issues that come from that, she has gone against the grain consistently on so many of the orthodoxies that exist in Britain and that seem to stifle and deaden any form of real debate, whether it's on global warming or whether it's on the doctrine of multiculturalism, or indeed on progressive teaching methods in our schools, as illustrated by another book that she wrote some time ago called All Must Have Prizes, which is the most wonderful dissection of the various doctrines that were, as she put it, destroying the education system in Britain. So it's really impossible not to be inspired as a journalist by her achievements. She was Young Journalist of the Year in 1976. I hope you don't mind me mentioning it. And then she was winner of the Orwell Prize for Journalism in 1996. That is the most prestigious journalistic prize in Britain. Perhaps it is this formidable work, which means that her critics are often reduced when they interview her or when they are attacking her to personal abuse, as opposed to actually answering her points and answering the questions that she poses in her work. I think in the case of one particular interview that Melanie did in 2003, it was in a paper called The Guardian that she used to work for. The interviewer said, I think with a certain amount of wishful thinking on his part, he felt that she was tiring of the battle, as he put it. Well, he hadn't seen anything yet. That's all that I can say. Because in 2006, Melanie produced Londonistan, book here, which I'm sure familiar with. It was probably, I think, her most important work yet. And it came after the year 2005, which saw the 7/7 bombings in London, suicide bombings. And it was at a time, just to give it the context, where police commissioners in London were saying, for example, that the words Islam and terrorism could not in any stretch of the imagination be put together in the same sentence. This was actually the time, this was after the bombings. The book came out in 2006, and it was remarkable for a number of reasons. First of all, it showed how Britain was a nation, and indeed some would say still is a nation, which is in denial about Islamic fundamentalism and Islamic terrorism. It showed a society where the ruling class, or if you like, the political class, what you like, really, as I said, don't do religion, so consequently they couldn't possibly even understand the idea of something inspired by religion. She wrote of an unholy pact that was really created in the 1990s in Britain, which meant that the British authorities sort of turned a kind of blind eye to Muslim extremism, Islamism, in exchange, if you like, for a quiet life at home. She also showed, and I think this was an important part of the book, how multiculturalism, moral relativism, and a sort of perverted notion of human rights had effectively laid the ground for Britain's failure to confront those within its borders who might wish to destroy it. And she also showed how it was possible, therefore, that bombers, the 7/7 bombers, needn't be necessarily foreign or oppressed radicals, but actually might be homegrown, young, British-born men. Londonistan is quite a remarkable book. And I think, again, amongst your critics, Melanie, I think it wouldn't have been lost on you that people might have attacked the book or might have attacked you, but I think I never remember a single moment when they actually saw anything that was not right and true about what she was saying. The story of how Londonistan actually came to be published is actually a bit of folklore in political circles, in publishing circles in Britain now, in the sense that Melanie simply couldn't get it published in the UK at all. Eventually, it was an American publisher who took it on, and through him, there was a small new publisher in Britain called Gibson Square, who finally published the book, which went on then to be a bestseller and reprinted and revised. There is a terrible symmetry about that, actually. Here we are in the 20th anniversary year of the fatwa of Salman Rushdie, and there's been some sort of celebration of this in Britain. Some columnists have been very complacent, saying, in fact, we've come a long way. But in fact, the publisher who published Londonistan was recently the victim of a firebomb attack over a novel called The Jewel of Medina. So have we come a long way? I would leave that up to you to ponder. But without further ado, gone on long enough, I really wanted to wrap up by saying that in the case of Melanie, this award is given for a journalist of high distinction, but also great personal courage. And I would say that it was never better awarded, because the courage that Melanie shows is on two fronts. First of all, she shows enormous courage of her convictions and never flinches, often in an environment in Britain where there's a kind of groupthink which doesn't allow for any opposition and will demonise those who do oppose. So that shows enormous courage to begin with. But secondly, she has written about things which, the way things are now, could give rise to possible actual danger. And this has not stopped her. Long may she continue to write. And Melanie, I would like, on behalf of everybody here, to present you with the Sappho Award this year.
Immigration at Heathrow Airport into complete frenzy when I arrived with that lot. Thank you, Peter. I'm very touched by your very, very kind and quite undeserved words. In fact, I'm quite overwhelmed, ladies and gentlemen, by this whole thing. Nothing as nice as this has ever happened to me before. I don't think I've ever heard so many nice things said about me. In fact, I wasn't quite sure who Peter was talking about. I thought he must have got his wires crossed to be talking about something completely different. And quite honestly, it's not what I'm used to at home at all, and it's enough to turn a girl's head. But it's really very, very good of you, and I'm very touched and honoured to be given this award. And I can't tell you how important it is to me to have support like this. Because it does tend to get a bit lonely sometimes. You know, you sit there in front of your computer screen and you think, is there anyone out there who is actually listening and agreeing? Or are they all basically sitting there going, oh, I can't stand this dreadful woman anymore? And I'm kept going by people writing to me in great numbers, as they do, saying, you must keep going, you speak for us. And I'm kept going by audiences like yourselves who do actually appreciate what I'm writing, and much to my amazement even might agree with me, at least some of the time. And that is of enormous importance, and I simply couldn't do what I do if I didn't have that kind of support and the knowledge of that kind of support. So I'm extremely grateful to you, and I'm delighted to be here in this really delightful place. And thank you so much for this award and for having me as your guest today. So I'm going to make a few remarks for a while about the issue that brings us together, freedom of speech and the threat that is posed to it, and then I believe there'll be some time for some questions. So freedom of speech, I don't have to tell you, is one of the core values of the free world. Without freedom of speech there can be no free thought, and as we know, it's under threat as never before. And like the general threat to the free world, it's a threat to freedom of speech which is being mounted not just from outside the free world, but also from inside. The onslaught from without is, in my view, being made easier by the erosion from within. Now, the onslaught from outside comes from the Islamic Jihad. It's taking many forms. A few weeks ago, as you may know, the United Nations Human Rights Council, so-called, approved a resolution calling upon member states to provide legal protection against defamation of religions and incitement to religious hatred in general. It was phrased in the plural, but no prizes for guessing what they had in mind. The proposal came from Pakistan, had the backing of the 57 government organisation of the Islamic Conference, the UN's largest voting bloc, which has effectively taken it prisoner, and so it was clear that Islam was the only religion the drafters had in mind which had to be exempted from criticism called defamation. And now we've seen this week Durban 2, the second World Conference on Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia and Related Intolerance, all of which of course is on display at Geneva. underway this week, which threatens in its final declaration, and for all I know they've already passed it, to prohibit criticism of Islam as a form of incitement. Now, this is all part of a relentless strategy by the Islamists to use the United Nations as a vehicle for the jihad to rewrite international law and overturn the core values of the West as part of its jihad against the free world. In March last year, the Organization of the Islamic Conference developed what the Associated Press called a battle plan to use the law against Islamophobia by curbing free speech. That month it changed the mandate for the UN Human Rights Council's rapporteur on freedom of expression, who was now to be expected to report to the Council on all instances in which individuals, quote, abused their freedom of speech by giving expression to racial or religious bias. In other words, the UN has voted to force the official charge with protecting freedom of expression to suppress it instead when it comes to the issue of Islam. In June last year, the UN Human Rights Council President announced that criticism of Sharia law would not be tolerated. This followed pressure upon the Council by the Islamist delegates after NGOs tried to raise the plight of women under Sharia. And what you might as well think is a really quite distinctively peculiar term phrase. The Egyptian delegate claimed that silencing these NGOs was necessary to ensure that, quote, Islam will not be crucified in this council. As we've seen from the Durban II meeting in Geneva this week, the UN Human Rights Council has turned the human rights it's supposed to protect into a mockery. This is because the Council has been hijacked by the Islamic states, which have turned the United Nations, the iconic embodiment of Western liberal values of reason and negotiation, justice and peace, into a kind of suicide bomb strapped to the underbelly of the free world. The free world embraces the UN. It's been turned into a hideous weapon against its own values. And just as the West really cannot see that the United Nations Club of Terror has turned into the negation of freedom, so it's being equally undermined from within by a crisis of confusion over the core values the free world is supposedly trying to defend, including freedom of speech. It has repeatedly sold the pass over freedom of speech. First, there was the fatwa against Salman Rushdie, its 20th anniversary, which falls this year over the satanic verses, when Britain failed to prosecute a single person, I think I'm right in saying, for threatening to murder him. Then there was the Muhammad cartoons, which I don't need to tell you about. And now London in particular is a magnet for libel tourism, with the draconian British libel laws being successfully used by wealthy Arabs to intimidate authors and publishers into censoring exposés of the hidden links between Islamic terror and its financing. So, on the ball are they with this libel tourism, that when I, on my blog, mention this phenomenon of libel tourism, and mention very carefully, because of the British libel laws, the gentleman, the Arab who was behind the main onslaught on this libel tourism, I simply mentioned it as a phenomenon that was occurring. I didn't say what he'd done or anything. Within hours, the Spectator, whose website I'm on, my blog is on, got a letter, a lawyer's letter from him. Even for mentioning the phenomenon with which he was concerned, produced a lawyer's letter threatening a libel action. Now, you might call this onslaught against free speech the jihad of the word. The suppression of free speech is such an important part of the Islamic jihad worldwide. This is because we're not just facing terrorism, we're facing a pincer movement by global Islamism to attack the West, using both terrorism, or hard jihad if you like, and cultural infiltration or pressure, or soft jihad. The two work together and separately to advance the same end, the Islamization of the West and the recall of the Muslim world to an austere and anti-liberty form of Islam. In other words, what I'm suggesting is that the real battleground, I think, in this war that we are facing for civilization is not the battleground of terror, awful as that is and important as that is. The really important battleground to me, that the Islamists understand very well, that the West does not appreciate, the battleground that we're actually on is the battleground of the mind. The Islamists understand that by capturing the mind, they can win. They capture the minds of the Islamic world, the Muslim world, and therefore they recruit terrorists to the cause, and they attack the minds of the West and the free world by confusing and demoralizing and terrorizing the designated target population and thus weakening them. All over Europe, our elites are caving into this soft terrorism of the jihad of the word. But Britain is the principal target and recruitment centre for both kinds of this terrorism because it has allowed the creation within its shores, inside its shores, of the most extensive network of terrorism and radicalisation outside the Muslim world. And the reason for that, why Britain has allowed this to happen, is the hollowing out of British culture, which has paralysed it by the development of such phenomena as multiculturalism, human rights law, and cultural Marxism, otherwise known as political correctness. These developments have made its political, security, and intellectual establishment in Britain simply incapable of acknowledging this pincer movement that's at work and therefore dealing with the threat that it's posed. Our establishment in Britain fully understands the threat of terrorism. It has literally thousands, it says, as our security service, of young Muslims who are into terrorism. It has literally dozens of major terrorist plots that it is currently watching. So they understand that all right, but what they fail to acknowledge, what they refuse to acknowledge, is the true nature, origins, and full strategic dimension of the attack. And they fail to grasp it is a cultural attack, a battleground of the mind, because what they fail and refuse, in fact, in Britain to acknowledge is that this is indeed a religious war, a holy war. They say instead that this is terrorism driven by grievances, that it's fueled by a distortion of Islam, that the antidote, therefore, is to win Muslim hearts and minds by acceding to their demands, for example, that Islam should be afforded a privileged status in British society afforded to no other minority group. So instead of holding the line for Western British values, the government and security establishment show at every juncture that they will cave in to intimidation. For example, the government and security world still will not speak about Islamic terrorism. One senior official says, "We must talk in a language which is not offensive." Another says, "The terrorist threat must not be described as a Muslim problem." The government has given an order that the word terrorism must not be associated with the word Islamic, Islamist, or Muslim. In a speech on counter-terrorism earlier this year, our Home Secretary Jackie Smith, the government minister who is responsible for keeping us safe, declared violent extremism of the kind that we are talking about today to be, quote, anti-Islamic. Now, if you go in for insanity like that, there is no way that you can ever win this thing. If you can't even bring yourself to name the threat that is facing you because you are too terrified even to do so, then you will be defeated by it. The problem that we face is that because of terror and ideology, our government in Britain defines the threat as not just violence, but violent extremism, not religious extremism. It doesn't see religious fanaticism as a threat at all, and so it doesn't see the refusal by radical Islamists to tolerate criticism of Islam. It doesn't see that in itself as a threat to our values. On the contrary, so anxious is it to pacify Muslims in general that our government genuflects to their demand that no offence must ever be caused to their religion. Government does so because it believes that by doing so, it can thus defuse Muslim anger and control violent extremism. But I'm afraid it is the British government that is being controlled and led by the nose to surrender its core values. Now, the reason it's so bamboozled and confused is that Britain and countries in continental Europe have been badly weakened by their own internal cultural confusion and erosion of core values, a confusion the Islamists are busily exploiting. Two areas in particular stand out, and they are closely related. One, referred to by Peter earlier, is multiculturalism, and the other is the terror of giving offence. Now, many people think multiculturalism is just another word for showing respect and tolerance to other cultures and faiths. And if that was so, there should be no argument about it. We should all show respect and tolerance as the essence of a liberal society. But that's not what multiculturalism is at all. Multiculturalism is a very specific doctrine that holds that all minority values must have equal status to those of the majority. Any attempt to uphold majority values over the minority is a form of prejudice. Now, that turns minorities automatically into a kind of cultural battering ram to destroy the very idea of being a majority culture at all as illegitimate and prejudiced. And so, since under this doctrine, no culture can assert itself over any other, liberalism, liberal values, cannot assert themselves as the dominant cultural force. Instead, society must fragment into a kaleidoscope of equal and opposing values. Liberal values must give way to their opposite, and the values that ultimately win are the values that are strongest. In other words, the values that are backed by the threat of violence. Now, that, of course, is precisely what happened over the Muhammad cartoons. Freedom of expression, as we know, is a key liberal concept. But under multiculturalism, that key liberal value of ours cannot trump a minority faith which holds that to publish those images is to give offence which cannot be tolerated. So the minority wins over the liberal majority value, and Europeans decry not the violence and the intimidation, the kidnappings, riots and murder which followed the republication of those cartoons, but instead liberals in Britain decried the offence to minority religious feeling that was given in publishing. In other words, it was the publishers of the cartoons that were at fault, not the people who murdered people around the world because of their publication. Worse still, but allied to this, multiculturalism has simply turned our values literally upside down and inside out. It's reversed the notion of truth and lies, victim and victimizer. This is how it goes. Since minorities can do no wrong because they are oppressed by the majority and they are powerless, they cannot be held responsible for acts such as suicide bombings, and that therefore the suicide bombings must be the fault of the victims, if the victims are the majority culture. Now, this key confusion, which has caused intellectual and moral paralysis throughout the West, plays directly into pathological Muslim victim culture, which makes dialogue impossible. And this is how this goes. So many Muslims genuinely believe that they are really under attack by the West, which they think is a giant conspiracy to destroy Islam. So they represent their own aggression as legitimate self-defense, and the West's legitimate self-defense as aggression. Now, this fundamental untruth has created what I have often called a dialogue of the demented. You simply can't have a conversation with people who turn the situation so completely upside down. It is literally like talking to a lunatic. But instead of treating it as the mad discourse that it is, and refusing to play along with it, Britain regards it merely as an extension of its own multicultural minority rights doctrine, which routinely reverses victim and aggressor whenever any minority is involved. So the untruths driving the Islamist terror are merely deepened, particularly since the left, which controls British and European culture, demonises the arch-villains of this narrative, America and Israel. So the central Islamist perception, which is a mad reversal of the truth being that they, the Islamists, are attacking America and Israel, and their representation of this is that, on the contrary, America and Israel are attacking them. This central Islamist perception of the big and little Satan, America and Israel, is not resisted by Britain, which tells Islamists and Muslims the truth. It is echoed in mainstream British discourse, where anti-Americanism is rampant, or indeed was rampant until the sainted one arrived in the White House, and Israel is well on the way to being delegitimized altogether. This acts catastrophically as an echo chamber for Muslim prejudice, reinforcing it and fueling the sense of paranoia and victimization. And it's also released in Britain and elsewhere the virus of Judeophobia, with claims of a world Jewish conspiracy, a rerun of medieval blood libels, leading to rising numbers of physical attacks on Jews in Britain, and now routinely said in our mainstream media. Our debased liberalism in these ways has thus negated the power of reason itself, the key characteristic of liberal thinking. It produces murderous prejudice and weakens the West in its defense against Islamism by paving the way for its many distortions and twisted thinking to take even deeper root. Let's take another one, the key Islamist demand, that Islamist terrorism must be seen as having nothing to do with Islam, and that to link these two things is evidence of Islamophobia. Now this is in turn another example of the jihadi tactic of using the West's own corrupted values to sow confusion and turn into a weapon against itself. And this has been achieved. The West's victim culture, the belief that all minorities are victims of the majority, and so any attempt to hold them to account is a form of prejudice, is used to label all attempts to tell the truth about Islamic violence or cultural conquest as a form of prejudice in order to silence it. And because of the dominance of victim culture and the terror of being accused of prejudice against an ethnic minority, which can lose you your job and certainly your friends, as well as the implicit threat of violence unless this demand is met, the West has caved into this. So freedom has been turned inside out. In Britain, we now have demonstrations in which the freedom of Muslims to protest on the street is protected, so they're going on the streets, they're calling to behead infidels or cause death to Jews. This is tolerated by the British police as their right to free expression, but those British citizens who pass by and who are enraged by this and try and stop it are threatened themselves with arrest. So defending Western liberal values is criminalised, ironically, by a society exercising liberal tender regard for minority rights. We've seen Geert Wilders, the leader of the Dutch Freedom Party, who defends Western freedom against Islamic violence. The Amsterdam Court of Appeals has ordered his prosecution for criticising Islam, and it was Geert Wilders who was banned by our British Home Secretary, the one who says that Islamic violence is anti-Islamic, from entering Britain for threatening public order, while she allows a procession of Islamists who preach death to Jews, destruction of Israel and defeat of the West to come and go as they please. And this is because it is Muslims who threaten violence when hearing something that displeases them, while the authorities know that whatever violent threats or libels are thrown at the Jews, they'll never harm anyone. So it is, from that point of view, horribly true that if Geert Wilders comes in, there is more of a threat of violence than if a jihadi goes onto the streets and says, death to all Jews, there won't be any violence. It is a horrible truth. And thus, the doctrine of free speech has now been replaced in Britain by the doctrine that violence pays. But it's not just fear that's turned all this inside out. It's this overriding importance within Western society of not giving offence, which has paralysed us when we are faced with the same demand made of us by Muslims. Now, the prohibition against giving offence arises from the importance we now attach to the subjective individual and the primacy of respecting their feelings. With the rise of group rights and victim culture, the giving of offence is seen as an assault on someone's very identity, and it's therefore classed as prejudice regardless of whether the giving offence is actually well-founded in truth. Prejudice is how it's defined, and prejudice is the crime of crimes, and so the giving of offence, regardless of the context, is criminalised as hate speech when it's a minority being offended. Now, in Britain, attempts by Muslims to criminalise as hate speech truth-telling about the jihad took the form of a law against incitement to religious hatred. This was watered down after a campaign which was driven mainly by outrage that popular comedians would no longer feel able to tell jokes on TV about religion, such as the priorities of the British public. Although it was watered down, it was still passed, and there are signs of caving in on this all over the place. A television programme, Dispatches, produced a programme called Undercover Mosque, which uncovered really very disturbing evidence indeed of incitement to murder of homosexuals, the killing of British soldiers, and hatred of unbelievers going on below the official radar in ostensibly respectable British mosques. But instead of prosecuting the fanatics who were preaching this violent stuff, the police and the prosecution authority turned on the television producers, accusing them of selective editing, distortion, and fatal crimes undermining community cohesion, aka upsetting the Muslims. The police then referred the whole program to the broadcasting watchdog, to its credit, threw it out, and the program producers successfully sued the police for libel. But what sort of a situation we come to where telling the truth about what's going on in the mosques is criminalised, or the attempts are made to criminalise it in this way, and no action is taken against the people who are doing the incitement? At another occasion, a Muslim police community support officer, that's a kind of ancillary police officer, stopped two Christian preachers from handing out Bible extracts because they were in a, quote, Muslim area. The police officer said they couldn't therefore preach there, and that attempting to convert Muslims to Christianity was a hate crime. The officer involved did not uphold the law of the land, which gives people the freedom to say in public whatever they want within the law, and certainly preaching Christianity in Britain, which is still a Christian country, is, as far as I knew when I last looked, very much within the law. Instead, he upheld the Islamist principle that this particular area of an English city was a Muslim area within which it was not permissible to do anything contrary to Muslim principles, such as preach Christianity. Now, this whole business of hate crime marches under the banner of human rights. But hate crime criminalizes the wrong kind of thought. So how can it be a human right? To me, it's a human wrong. But it's been developed because human rights, in quotes, has been transformed from the rights of the individual to the rights of groups, which has turned human rights law from a tool of freedom into an instrument of oppression. This is a long and complicated argument which I won't go into at the moment. But basically, European elites are now using hate crime legislation under the banner of human rights law to silence people with opinions that do not conform to prevailing orthodoxy. It favours minorities being treated differently. There are favoured minorities who are treated differently from the majority, from whom freedom is restricted and justice stood on his head. For example, in 2000, a woman called Alison Redmond Bate was convicted of obstructing a police officer who stopped her from preaching with her mother on the steps of Wakefield Cathedral after a crowd of more than 100 angry people gathered and shouted at them to shut up. The previous year, she'd been found guilty of willful obstruction after allegedly unsettling the crowd by warning them not to turn their backs on God. Well, I can see how that's upsetting, but is that really a crime? Fortunately, this conviction was in fact overturned by one of our more robust justices, Lord Justice Sedley, who said when he allowed her appeal that free speech surely had to include, quote, the irritating, the contentious, the eccentric, the heretical, the unwelcome, and the provocative. Well, amen to all that, but that was small comfort to a man called George Staunton, a 78-year-old war veteran, who embellished posters he was putting up on the wall for the UK Independence Party, which opposes British membership of the EU, with the legends, "Don't forget the 1945 war," and "Free speech for England." He was arrested and charged with racially aggravated criminal damage, a case that was eventually dropped by the police, who nevertheless boasted of having launched a, quote, dramatic, painstaking, dawn till dusk surveillance operation against racist graffiti, which netted one 78-year-old man whose crime was to believe that Britain should be independent of Europe to uphold the liberties for which he had fought. In Britain last year, a law banning incitement to hatred on the grounds of sexual orientation was amended to include a free speech clause exempting from prosecution general discussion or criticism of homosexuality, a move which campaigners hailed as providing protection for comedians, them again, and those opposed to same-sex unions. But another bill, which has just been going through Parliament, has overturned this legal protection for free speech. The crime of inciting homophobic hatred includes any words or behaviour which is intended to stir up hatred and carries a maximum sentence of 7 years in prison. Now, these are just examples that I'm giving you to to illustrate my point that far from expanding liberty, human rights law diminishes it. It's become a tool to enforce the power of minorities against the majority. and enforce, and this is the crucial point, enforce a narrative of unchallengeable virtue, even if it is actually a narrative of lies, by shutting the truth out of public discourse altogether. The point I'm making is that human rights law regards these things as unarguable. It is unarguable that you must not insult homosexuals. It is unarguable that you must not insult Muslims. It is unarguable that you must not insult minorities, because that is a narrative of unchallengeable virtue. There can be no dissent from it at all. If you dissent from it, you are a bigot. It doesn't benefit you to say, well, actually, my Christian faith means that I cannot agree to same-sex adoption. You're not allowed that freedom anymore in Britain. You are a bigot. It's a narrative of unchallengeable virtue. It is the one revealed truth. Racism, sexism, homophobia, Islamophobia. But not Judeophobia, not Israelophobia. Indeed, those phobias are, in London, in Britain, mandatory. I'm exaggerating slightly, but I'm a journalist. But now we have a situation where, in Britain, the big lies are being told about Israel, which lead to, on the streets, an eruption of prejudice, bigotry, bullying, and physical attack. We have an Orwellian situation where blood libels, and I use that phrase advisedly, which incite hatred, peddling the calumny of a cosmic conspiracy by Jews who hijack public policy and control the world, that discourse is entirely permitted, normal, no one turns a hair. But those who do turn a hair, those Jews who protest at this true hate speech, if they protest, that protest is deemed to be proof of the Jewish power to control public debate. How can this be? Well, it's because Jews fall foul of the prevailing Marxist definition of prejudice. Prejudice, under this definition, only applies to those with power. The powerless cannot be bigots, they cannot be racist, they cannot be prejudiced, because they're powerless. Only the powerful can be prejudiced, and the powerful can therefore never be victims. And since Jews are seen as controlling Western capitalism, they certainly can't be seen as victims, despite being victims of the bigotry of that very observation. But Muslims are powerless, they're the third world, and so they can claim to be victims of Islamophobia. Thus, lies are given precedence over truth, because, I put it to you, truth can never be prejudice. True prejudice inescapably involves lies. And although undoubtedly some people are truly prejudiced against Muslims, as people are against any strangers or other people or creeds, Islamophobia, I would suggest, is a myth. The fear of Islam, such as it is not a prejudice, but a reasonable reaction to the violence and assault upon Western freedoms being carried out in the name of that religion. And yes, I do know, and I write all the time, that many, many Muslims do not subscribe to that. But nevertheless, it is violence being carried out in the name of a religion, underpinned by the senior theological authorities of that religion, in accordance with the theology and with the history of that religion. It's as absurd to say this is a phobia as it would have been to say resistance against Nazism was a phobia of Germans. Yet, while it is wrongly, in my view, called Islamophobia, and thus used to shut down legitimate and indeed essential debate about Islam and what's being done by some Islamists in its name, there is no such attempt to stop the defamation of Judaism that is rampant in the Arab and Muslim world and which is leading to a genocidal frenzy in that world and beyond. So, where should the line be drawn? I will bring my remarks to a close by tackling this very troubling issue. Where should the line be drawn when it comes to free speech? Well, my own view is that the giving of offence should never be criminalised. Take Holocaust denial. Holocaust denial is not an offence in Britain, and I very, very strongly believe that it should not be an offence in Britain. After all, if Holocaust denial was an offence on the basis that it is a species of anti-Semitism, which it undoubtedly is, we would have to censor vast amounts of English literature, because anti-Semitism infests English literature. The problem is that the giving of offence shades into incitement. incitement to hatred, incitement to violence, and it's very difficult in a liberal society to know where to draw that line. So, for example, we have, at the moment, we have Hizb ut-Tahrir, which is a worldwide organization that is working to re-establish the Islamic Caliphate and works to establish the overthrow of Western values and Western society. We have been recruiting young Muslims on our campuses in very large number to the jihad, to violence at one extreme, and even if you don't go that far, to hatred, and to what used to be called, when I was young, sedition, working against their own country. So, should Muslims in Britain or in the West be able to call for the overthrow of the British state and rule by Sharia and incite hatred against Jews, hatred against Americans, hatred against the West? Where should we draw the line? Well, I think that context matters a lot. Take Holocaust denial again. Holocaust denial should not be a crime, in my view, in the United Kingdom, because there it's not really likely to lead to any harm, not serious harm. But in a country like Austria or Germany, where Nazism remains a potential threat, those sentiments can become an active threat to the security of the state. And so it's not, I wouldn't say that Austria was wrong or Germany was wrong to criminalise it. They have a very different context that they're dealing with. I think similar consideration should apply to Muslim extremism, because we're not acting in a vacuum. These preachers of hate, as we call them in Britain, are not operating in a vacuum. They're not. It's not like some marginal some marginal group which is speaking in public and 5 people turn up and nothing much happens. They are recruiting to the jihad. In Britain and Europe, radical Islamist sentiments are being used to recruit terrorists and radicalise young Muslims against their own country and fellow citizens. These sentiments, therefore, are an active danger to the security of the state. Even if they're not involved in violence themselves, they are helping produce the sea in which violence swims. In other words, what I'm saying is this, that freedom of expression is indeed a core principle of our Western liberal democracy, but it is not the only principle, and it is not the supreme principle. It has to be balanced against other principles, such as the preservation of life and liberty. Now, for some people, what I'm saying is heresy. Any diminution of free speech is said to undermine liberal values. But this is the paradox that we face. A liberal society has to, in my view, exercise very robust, muscular, and indeed, one could say, sometimes illiberal actions, measures, to defend itself. If it doesn't do that, it will not survive as a liberal society. That is the paradox of liberalism. You have to adopt hard measures in order to protect the liberal values that you hold dear, and if you don't want to do that, if you flinch from that, if you say, I'm sorry, it's much more important that Hizb ut-Tahrir has the freedom to preach on campus. Fine, that's your choice, sunshine, but you're going to have a country that's going to be engulfed by Islamization and violence. And that's the consequences of your action, because liberalism is in danger of disappearing up its own backside. So, we have to be robust in defending liberal values. But there's another point I want to raise with you, and I really will finish. And that's this, that we think we're a liberal society. Well, I don't like you in Denmark, maybe you are. But we in Britain, in my view, are no longer liberal at all. The idea that in Britain we have the freedom to say what we want is simply untrue. This is because, and this is where we come back to the correspondence between the liberal West, so-called liberal West, and the Islamists. The Islamists are in the business of creating heaven on earth, literally, God's kingdom on earth. And so is the liberal West. The liberal West believes that it has the capacity and the duty to create a new and perfect world. A world without war, a world without prejudice, a world without bigotry, a world without the nation-state which inescapably leads to war, prejudice and bigotry. A new and perfect world. And just like all millenarian but that's what it is. Millenarian and Manichaean movements, which are on the path to redemption and have to clear away the obstacles in the way of utopia in order to get there. So the liberal West, over a vast range of issues, regards it as axiomatic that only one truth is to be permitted on these issues, and that any deviation is considered a heresy which has to be punished by social or professional ostracism. I'm not just talking about the kind of hate crimes I was talking about earlier, racism, sexism, all that sort of stuff. I'm talking about issues such as, and here I will lose you all, global warming, intelligent design, or the doctrine that matter had originally a creator, the war in Iraq, and of course Israel. You deny the first, global warming, support the other three, intelligent design, war in Iraq, Israel, and you are demonized. You can't get articles or books published, you lose your chances of promotion or even your job. If you're an academic scientist denying global warming or arguing for intelligent design, you are thrown out. No debate is to be permitted, no dissent is to be permitted, no deviations permitted from these absolute, unchallengeable, revealed truths. And so we have, as far as Israel is concerned, a rampant delegitimization of Israel and demonization of Israel based on, in my view, one big lie after another, with no possibility of telling the public, most of whom know very little about the Middle East and are simply absorbing these lies as truth, no way of telling the public that there's another story, that these are lies. No way of putting before them facts which show that they are lies. So we have boycotts of Israeli and Jewish academics. We have theatres which stage events commemorating the events of Dea Yassin, a supposed atrocity by Israel before it was even created, but which refuse to host an Israeli Independence Day celebration because it will involve people who serve in the Israel Defense Force, a conscript army who are acting as actors. We have, as I said before, demonization and delegitimization of Israel driving physical attacks on Jews. Anyone who speaks up against it is demonized and ostracized. So what we have in Britain now is what I would call a soft totalitarianism of one revealed truth, which parallels the Islamist agenda to impose its one revealed truth upon the world. It's an identical kind of millenarianism, pursuit of utopia, and a determination to eradicate all obstacles to that utopia. For the Greens, the obstacle to utopia is industrialization. For transnational progressives who believe that the nation-state is the cause of all ills, and the sainted UN, the sainted EU, and the sainted European Court of Human Rights, human rights law, and all transnational laws and institutions are the sole source of legitimacy. For those transnational progressives, the obstacle to utopia is the nation. For the left, the obstacle to utopia is American exceptionalism. For the Western intelligentsia, it's Israel. And for the Islamic world, it's all the above and the entire un-Islamic world as an obstacle to utopia. In this Manichaean desire for redemption and the totalitarian suppression of dissent from the one revealed truth and the path of virtue, I'm afraid I have to tell you that I think that Western liberals and radical Islam are uncomfortably closer than they would like to think. And I would suggest to you finally that unless we understand our own vulnerability, and unless we understand the values that we need to defend, and the contradictions that the values of our post-Enlightenment West have thrown up, we can't hope to defend the liberal society that we have. Which is why, to come back to where I started, it is so very important that organisations like the Free Press Society and yourselves carry on doing the work that you're doing. Thank you so much.